In the annals of American Gothic horror, few tales are as deeply rooted in the soil of their origin as that of Martha Purnell. It is a story born of the fetid air and black water of Maryland's eastern shore, a narrative that suggests the deepest horrors are not supernatural, but are instead cultivated in the dark earth of human desperation. Before the legend, there was the land. Before the monster, there was the woman. And before the screams, there was the unsettling, ever-present sound of her hogs, rooting in the mud at the edge of the swamp. It was said their hunger was a reflection of the land itself, patient, indiscriminate, and absolute in its final consumption of all things. If you are drawn to the shadows where history and horror converge, and this is your first time crossing our threshold, consider subscribing to ensure you do not miss the turning of a single page in these forgotten archives. The year was 1827. To understand the story of Martha Purnell, one must first understand the piece of earth she inhabited, a place that seemed to actively resist human settlement. Worcester County, on Maryland's eastern shore, was a labyrinth of brackish rivers, tidal creeks, and vast, impenetrable swamps. The Great Pocomoke Swamp, a sprawling expanse of cypress and black gum trees, dominated the landscape, its dark waters staining the rivers the color of tea. The air itself was a palpable presence, thick with humidity for much of the year, carrying the mingled scents of salt marsh, pine resin, and the sweet, cloying odor of decay. It was a place of profound, oppressive isolation. Farms were not so much communities as they were solitary islands carved out of the dense woods and marshland, separated by miles of treacherous, often impassable terrain. A neighbor might live only 3 miles away, but those 3 miles could consist of sucking mud, tangled briars, and waterways that swelled and receded with the inscrutable logic of the tides. Sound traveled strangely here, muffled by the dense foliage and the ever-present fog. A cry for help could be swallowed by the cypress knees before it traveled 100 yards. This physical isolation bred a corresponding isolation of the spirit. The people who clung to this land were shaped by its unforgiving nature. They were a people accustomed to hardship, to meager yields from soil that was often too sandy or too saturated, and to the constant threat of diseases that festered in the stagnant water. Life was a relentless cycle of toil, governed by the rising and setting of a sun often obscured by a hazy, milk-white sky. Superstition thrived in this environment, nurtured by the deep shadows of the swamp and the unsettling quiet of the long, damp winters. It was a place where the veil between the natural and the unnatural felt perilously thin. Locals spoke of strange lights hovering over the marshes, of spirits of the long-dead Nanticoke tribesmen who were said to guard the ancient cypress trees, and of creatures that lurked in the black water, things for which they had no name. These stories were more than mere entertainment. They were a way of giving shape to the anxieties that the landscape itself produced, a way of explaining the unexplainable in a world where the known threats were already legion. Every snapped twig in the woods at night, every strange ripple on the surface of a creek, could be a sign of something malevolent. The environment was not a backdrop for life. It was an active participant, an ever-present antagonist that demanded vigilance and bred a deep, abiding suspicion of the unknown. Into this world of physical and psychological isolation was woven a social fabric of profound and brutal tension. The economy of the Eastern Shore, like much of the American South, was built upon the institution of chattel slavery. This fact was the central, organizing principle of life, an open wound that poisoned every interaction and defined every relationship. The constant, simmering fear of insurrection was a palpable force. It manifested in the nightly patrols that rode the muddy lanes, in the draconian laws that governed the lives of both enslaved and free black residents, and in the pervasive paranoia that saw conspiracy in every gathering, rebellion in every whispered word. For the enslaved, this was a world of unending dread. The Pocomoke Swamp, for all its natural terrors, also represented a sliver of hope, a potential pathway to freedom on the network that would one day be known as the Underground Railroad. It was a place of immense danger, filled with venomous snakes, biting insects, and the constant threat of capture by slave patrols, who knew the terrain with predatory intimacy. Yet, the wilderness offered a better chance than the certain brutality of the plantations. Every runaway who slipped into the fog-drenched woods was a testament to a desperate courage, a gamble made against terrifying odds. This brutal system created a moral swamp as dense and treacherous as the physical one. Poverty was rampant, affecting not just the enslaved but also many of the poor white farmers who scratched out a living on marginal land. It was a poverty that sharpened the edges of human interaction, making survival a zero-sum game. In a world of such scarcity and fear, compassion could be a liability, and cruelty a tool for self-preservation. Betrayal was a constant threat. An enslaved person seeking freedom had to navigate a landscape where any face, black or white, could be that of an informant, someone willing to trade a life for a handful of silver, or the fragile security of favor with the powerful. This was the social and environmental crucible that forged the legend of Martha Purnell. Her homestead was situated in one of the most isolated parts of the county, a small plot of land that seemed to be actively retreating into the embrace of the Pocomoke. It was not a farm in the traditional sense, for little was cultivated there. The fields were fallow, choked with weeds and saw palmetto, and the small garden was a riot of untended growth. The property was less a place of agriculture and more a grim, functional outpost on the edge of the wilderness. The track leading to her house was little more than 2 ruts in the earth, often flooded and impassable. The house itself was a small, unpainted clapboard structure that had weathered to the color of an old bone. The roof sagged in the middle, and the windows were dark, empty eyes staring out at the encroaching woods. A single stone chimney, crumbling at the top, issued a thin, almost constant plume of wood smoke that did little to disturb the heavy air. The entire property was surrounded by a crude fence, made of split rails that were gray with age and slick with a vibrant green moss. The fence was in a state of perpetual disrepair, leaning at odd angles, yet it seemed to mark a deliberate, psychological boundary between her small, blighted domain and the rest of the world. There was one peculiar detail that seemed utterly out of place, a single point of contradiction in the landscape of neglect. Beside the sagging front porch, a single rose bush grew with improbable vigor. Its blooms were a deep, shocking crimson, and it was meticulously tended, free of weeds and blight. It was the only sign of deliberate care on the entire property, a small, defiant splash of beauty against a backdrop of decay. This humanizing detail was often the first thing visitors, on the rare occasions she had any, would notice, a disarming touch that made what lay beyond it all the more unsettling. At the far edge of the property, pressed right up against the dark, foreboding line of the swamp, were the hog pens. There were 3 of them, constructed not of split rails but of thick, rough-hewn logs, stacked high and reinforced with iron bands at the corners. They were built with the solidity of a fortress, designed not merely to contain livestock, but to hold something that desperately wanted to escape. The ground within and around the pens was a churned morass of black mud and filth, even in the driest weather. The smell that emanated from this part of the property was overpowering, a foul miasma of excrement, rot, and something else, something vaguely metallic and sweet that clung to the back of the throat. No one ever saw Martha tend to these pens in the daylight. Her work there was done in the twilight hours, or under the cloak of darkness. But the sounds that came from the pens were a constant feature of the local soundscape for anyone unfortunate enough to live within earshot. There was the constant, low grunting and shuffling, but it was punctuated by noises of a more disturbing character, furious, high-pitched squeals of aggression, and the deep, guttural roars of beings that sounded far larger and more feral than ordinary farm animals. These sounds spoke of a ravenous, insatiable hunger. It was from these pens, from this dark corner of an already benighted land, that the whispers about Martha began to emanate, carried on the fog like spores, suggesting that the true menace of this land was not the spirits in the swamp or the desperation in men's hearts, but the quiet, solitary woman and the unspeakable purpose of the creatures she kept. The land had set the stage, and now the woman herself was about to take her place upon it. If the land itself was a source of a quiet, creeping dread, then Martha Purnell was the human embodiment of that dread, a figure who seemed to have risen from the swampy earth itself. She was a woman spoken of only in hushed tones, her name a kind of local shorthand for a particular brand of cold, unnerving isolation. Her reputation was not that of a simple recluse, for the eastern shore was full of solitary people who preferred the company of trees to that of their neighbors. Martha's isolation was different. It felt active, watchful, and deeply inhospitable. She was a presence even in her absence, a shadow that fell over the surrounding homesteads, a constant, unspoken question mark at the edge of the community's consciousness. Those who lived within a few miles of her property learned to read the signs of her activity, not with neighborly curiosity, but with a kind of primal caution. The thin column of smoke from her chimney was not a comforting sign of hearth and home, but a confirmation that the unsettling heart of that blighted land was still beating. The silence from her property was often more unnerving than any sound, a void that seemed to pull at the edges of the normal, rustling life of the woods. On the rare occasions, she was forced to venture into the small settlement that served as the area's commercial and social hub. Her arrival would cause a subtle but immediate shift in the atmosphere. It was said she moved with a peculiar, deliberate gait, her feet seeming to find purchase on the muddy ground with an unnatural certainty. She was not a large woman, but she projected an aura of dense, immovable strength. Her face, weathered by sun and hardship, was a mask of stoic indifference, her eyes the color of the winter sky over the marsh, revealing nothing of the thoughts behind them. When she entered the general store, conversations would falter and die. The proprietor, a man named Phineas who was known for his garrulous nature, would become taciturn and efficient, his movements stiff and economical. He would measure out her salt, her flour, her gunpowder, and take her payment without a word of the usual pleasantries. Other patrons would find reasons to study the shelves with sudden intensity, or would simply edge away, creating a small, invisible circle of emptiness around her. She never spoke unless it was absolutely necessary, and when she did, her voice was low and without inflection, the words emerging as flat and final as stones dropped into a well. She would ask for what she needed, state that she had the correct payment, and then she would be gone, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than the one that had preceded her arrival. Mothers would instinctively pull their children closer, not because Martha had made any threatening gesture, but because of a more primal, instinctual response to a presence that felt fundamentally wrong, like a hawk settling in a yard full of chickens. The tales that circulated about her were, at first, small things, anecdotes of a harsh and unforgiving nature that, in another person, might have been dismissed as mere eccentricity. There was the story of a young sharecropper, a boy named Samuel, whose family's well had run dry during a particularly brutal summer drought in 1825. Desperate, he had taken his wooden buckets to the creek that bordered Martha's land, the closest source of fresh water. Martha had appeared at the edge of the woods as if from nowhere, holding not a rifle, but a long, heavy stick of hickory. She had not shouted or threatened him. She had simply stood there, watching him, her gaze so cold and possessive that the boy had dropped his buckets and fled, telling his father later that he felt as if the water in the creek belonged to her, and that to take it would be a theft she would not abide. There was another tale, told by a trapper named Elias, who had been checking his lines deep in the Pocomoke. He had become disoriented in a sudden, thick fog, and had stumbled upon Martha's property from the swamp side. He saw her near the tree line, effortlessly hoisting a large, bulging burlap sack over her shoulder, a sack that seemed to hold a weight that would have strained a man of his own considerable strength. She had moved off into the woods with it, her steps sure and silent, disappearing into the mist as if she were a part of it. Elias never spoke of what he thought was in the sack, but the memory of her quiet, formidable strength and the utter solitude of her task haunted him for years. These stories, and others like them, painted a picture of a woman who was more than just unfriendly. They suggested a deep and abiding coldness, an almost complete lack of the empathy and mutual dependence that were the necessary currencies of survival in such a harsh environment. She was a closed circuit, a self-contained ecosystem of one who neither asked for help nor offered it. Her very existence was a quiet rebuke to the fragile bonds of community that held the scattered homesteads together. But it was her hogs that transformed her reputation from that of a harsh eccentric into something far more menacing and folkloric. They were the source of the darkest whispers, the focal point of the fear she inspired. These were not the common breeds of swine found on other farms. They were enormous creatures, larger than any hog the locals had ever seen, with thick, coarse hair the color of rust and dried blood. Their backs were unnaturally broad, their shoulders bunched with muscle, and they moved with a low, predatory grace that was deeply unsettling. Their snouts were long and powerful, and from their jaws protruded tusks that were yellowed and curved, more like those of a wild boar than a domesticated animal. But it was their eyes that were the most disturbing feature. They were small, intelligent, and seemed to burn with a malevolent awareness. When they looked at you, it did not feel like the vacant stare of livestock. It felt as if you were being assessed, measured as a potential threat, or, more chillingly, as a potential meal. They were rarely seen during the day. Martha kept them penned in their fortress-like enclosures at the swamp's edge, but their presence was always felt. The sounds they made were a key part of the local lore of fear. They did not squeal in the familiar way of farm pigs. Instead, they communicated in a series of deep, guttural grunts and rumbling growls that sounded more like the language of bears or some other large predator. At feeding time, which always seemed to occur in the dim, uncertain light of dusk, these sounds would escalate into a terrifying chorus of frenzied, aggressive roars that would carry through the damp air, causing nearby farmers to pause their work and cast an anxious glance towards the Pocomoke. The sound was not one of simple hunger. It was a sound of ravenous, insatiable fury, a sound of things tearing and rending. A traveling preacher, a man named Jedediah who passed through the county once every spring, claimed to have gotten a closer look than most. His horse had thrown a shoe on the lane near Martha's property, and he had approached the fence line, hoping to ask for the use of a hammer. He said he saw the hogs then, their massive forms moving restlessly in the muddy pen. He reported that one of them had stopped its pacing and turned to look directly at him. It had remained perfectly still for a long moment, its little eyes locked on his, and then it had let out a low, challenging roar that seemed to vibrate in his bones. The preacher, a man who claimed to fear neither God nor Satan, confessed that in that moment he had felt a terror so profound that he had backed away slowly. forgetting all about his horse's shoe, and had not stopped walking until he was a full mile down the road. He said the creature had not been an animal, but a demon wearing the flesh of a beast. The neighbors who lived closest to Martha, a family headed by a stoic farmer named Silas, learned to live with a constant, low-level hum of anxiety. Their children were forbidden from ever going near the woods that bordered her land. Their own dogs would sometimes stand at the edge of their yard, hackles raised, whining and growling at something unseen in the direction of the Purnell homestead. Silas and his wife, Ada, would lie awake some nights, listening to the sounds that drifted from the direction of the pens. They heard the usual aggressive feeding noises, but sometimes, late in the night, they would hear other things. They heard sounds of digging, of heavy things being dragged across the ground, and on one terrible occasion, a sound that Ada would later describe to her sister as a brief, high-pitched shriek, a sound that was abruptly cut off and followed by a deafening, frenzied roaring from the Hogs. Silas had told her it was likely a fox or a raccoon that had gotten too close to the pens, but neither of them truly believed it. The whispers began to change then, evolving from tales of a cold woman to something far darker. The question of what she fed those unnaturally large and aggressive animals became a topic of morbid speculation. People noted that while her fields lay fallow, and she bought only meager supplies of flour and salt, her hogs grew ever larger, ever more feral. The local stories of cruelty and her unsettling livestock began to merge, creating a new and terrifying narrative. The core question was no longer simply about her character, it was about her actions. Were the stories of her coldness just the fearful exaggerations of a superstitious community, or were they the pale foreshadowing of a truth too monstrous to be easily believed? The whispers were turning into accusations, and the stage was being set for the horrifying testimonies that would cement her name in the darkest corners of local history. The whispers that clung to Martha Purnell, like the ever-present swamp fog, began to coalesce into a narrative of profound and specific horror. Her reputation for coldness and the unsettling nature of her livestock were no longer subjects of idle speculation. They became the foundational elements of a story that would forever define her. The very geography of her homestead, a treacherous island of semi-solid ground on the fringe of the vast Pocomoke swamp, made it an unavoidable landmark for those who traveled through the wilderness. For the enslaved men and women who risked everything to flee the brutal plantations of the southern eastern shore, the swamp was both a sanctuary and a gauntlet. It offered concealment that no open field could provide, its dense canopy hiding them from the sun and the eyes of the slave patrols. But it was also a place of immense peril, a labyrinth of black water and sucking mud where a single misstep could lead to a slow, lonely death. Navigating this landscape required an almost supernatural instinct, and those who undertook the journey were propelled by a desperation that outweighed the terror of the unknown. They moved at night, guided by the stars when the canopy broke, or by the subtle shifts in the texture of the ground beneath their bare feet. It was in this context of extreme desperation that the faint, distant glimmer of a candle in Martha Purnell's window could appear as a beacon of hope. For a group of 3 runaways who had been in the swamp for 2 days, subsisting on nothing but brackish water and a handful of wild berries, the light was a potent symbol of potential salvation. Their names, according to the oral tradition that preserved their story, were Zephin, Alara, and Obadiah. Zephin, the eldest, was a man whose caution was born of a lifetime of observing the terrible consequences of small mistakes. Alara, his wife, carried within a small cloth pouch a single, smoothed river stone that her young son had given her, a tangible link to the family she prayed she would one day be able to send for. Obadiah was younger, his fear often overshadowed by a fiery impatience to put as much distance as possible between himself and the life he had escaped. They were exhausted, their clothes in tatters, their skin a tapestry of scratches and insect bites. The sight of the small, solitary house sparked a tense debate among them. Zephan argued that a lone light in such a place was a warning, not an invitation. He said it was more likely a trap than a refuge. But Obadiah, weakened by hunger, countered that they could not survive another night in the swamp. He insisted that any risk was better than the certainty of perishing in the wilderness. Alara, her hand clutching the stone in her pouch, eventually sided with Obadiah, her hope for a moment of respite overpowering her husband's grim pragmatism. Their approach to the homestead was one of extreme caution. They moved through the final stretch of woods like ghosts, their progress marked only by the softest rustle of leaves. The first thing they noticed was the unnatural quiet of the place, broken only by a low, intermittent grunting from the far side of the property. As they drew closer, they saw the house, a dark shape against a slightly less dark sky, and the single, defiant rose bush near the porch, its crimson blooms appearing almost black in the faint moonlight. The sight of it was disarming, a small detail of domesticity that seemed to contradict the oppressive desolation of the surroundings. Zephan's unease deepened, but it was too late to turn back. He gave a low, coded whistle, the call of a night bird, a signal often used by those seeking aid. The light in the window vanished for a moment, and then reappeared as the cabin door creaked open. Martha Purnell stood silhouetted in the doorway, a figure of indeterminate shape and size. She held no lantern and no weapon. She simply stood, waiting. Zephan, stepping into the clearing, explained their situation in a low, respectful voice. He said they were travelers who had become lost and were in need of food and a safe place to rest until morning. He offered her the last of their meager possessions, a small, worn knife, as payment. Martha, according to the legend, did not respond immediately. She seemed to study them from the darkness of the porch, her silence stretching for an uncomfortably long time. Then, she gave a curt nod and stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The inside of the cabin was sparse and obsessively clean. A small fire smoldered in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the bare wooden walls. She gave them water from a bucket and a piece of hard, stale bread for each of them. She did not ask their names or where they were from. Her charity was as cold and functional as the room itself. She told them they could not stay in the house. She explained, in her flat, toneless voice, that she had no room and that it was not safe for her to be seen harboring runaways. However, she said they could shelter in the old smokehouse at the back of the property until the following evening. She claimed that it was best they wait for the full cover of darkness before continuing their journey. This seemed, to the exhausted fugitives, like a reasonable precaution. They thanked her, their relief palpable. She led them out the back door and across the muddy yard, towards a small, windowless outbuilding. As they passed the formidable hog pens, a low, rumbling growl emanated from within, and the massive, dark shapes of the animals shifted restlessly. Alara instinctively moved closer to Zephan. Martha seemed to pay the sound no mind. She unbarred the thick wooden door of the smokehouse, revealing a small, dark space that smelled of old hickory smoke and damp earth. She told them to rest, and that she would bring them more water in the morning. Then she closed the heavy door, and they heard the thick wooden bar slide back into place. What happened next is the core of the Purnell legend, a sequence of events pieced together from the fearful imaginings of her neighbors and the fragments of testimony that survived in the oral tradition. The story holds that the three fugitives, huddled together in the pitch-black smokehouse, finally gave in to their profound exhaustion. They fell into a sleep born of desperation and a fragile, misplaced trust. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, a night with no moon and a sky shrouded in thick, low-lying clouds, the silence of the homestead was broken. It began not with a scream, but with the faint, creaking groan of heavy wood. It was the sound of the gate to one of the hog pens being slowly, deliberately opened. This was followed by a period of absolute silence that was, in its own way, more terrifying than any noise. It was a silence of anticipation, of held breath. Then came the sound of the bar being lifted from the smokehouse door. The story does not speak of what the three inside saw or felt in that initial moment. It focuses instead on the sounds that ripped through the night, sounds that would be seared into the memory of anyone who heard them. There was a single, sharp cry of alarm from a man, instantly followed by a woman's piercing shriek of pure terror. This shriek was not allowed to linger in the air. It was abruptly cut off, swallowed by an eruption of sound so savage and chaotic that it seemed to defy nature. The deep, guttural roars of the hogs, magnified and multiplied, exploded in a frenzy of unrestrained violence. This was not the sound of feeding, it was the sound of an attack, of a predatory onslaught. The terrified shouts of the men were lost in the cacophony, a brief, desperate counterpoint to the overwhelming fury of the beasts. There were sounds of a desperate struggle, of bodies being slammed against the wooden walls of the smokehouse, of splintering planks, and then, most horribly, the distinct, sharp crack of bone. The auditory narrative of the event, as passed down through generations, then shifted from the violence of the attack to the methodical horror of its aftermath. The frantic roaring subsided, replaced by a set of sounds even more gruesome. There were wet, tearing noises, the sickening crunch of cartilage, and the relentless, slobbering sounds of creatures engaged in a gluttonous feast. For what felt like an hour, this chorus of consumption was the only sound that broke the night's stillness, a grotesque symphony of absolute disposal. Finally, as the first hint of gray light began to touch the eastern sky, even these sounds faded, replaced by the low, contented grunts of sated animals. When the morning fog rolled in from the swamp, it blanketed the Purnell homestead, shrouding the smokehouse and the churned, muddy ground around it in a thick, white veil, as if to conceal the evidence of the night's unspeakable events. This act, according to the folklore, was not an isolated incident. It was the perfection of a grim and terrible system. Martha Purnell, the stories alleged, had turned her isolated homestead into a fatal lure for the most vulnerable of people. She was not merely a monster of random cruelty, she was an entrepreneur of betrayal. The legend suggests she had a standing arrangement with the local slave patrols. They knew that any runaway who disappeared into the Pocomoke swamp near her property was unlikely to ever emerge. She provided them with a service that no jail or gallows could offer, the complete and utter erasure of a human being. There would be no body to bury, no martyr for the cause of freedom, no evidence of a crime. There would only be an absence, a person who was there one day and gone the next, swallowed by the swamp. Her hogs were the instruments of this erasure. They were not livestock. They were a living, breathing apparatus of destruction. The diet she provided them, rich in a way that no corn mash or kitchen slop could ever be, accounted for their monstrous size, their extreme aggression, and their unnatural intelligence. They were not merely fed, they were cultivated, their basest, most predatory instincts sharpened to a razor's edge. The horror of Martha Purnell's alleged crimes was not simply that she killed people, it was that she had inverted the most basic principles of existence. A place of shelter had become a trap, a provider of food had become an executioner, and the act of feeding, a symbol of life and nurture, had become an act of complete and final annihilation. The story was told, a grim and gothic tale of betrayal and slaughter. But as the whispers spread and the legend grew, a critical question began to emerge from the miasma of fear. Were these horrifying accounts the literal truth, or had the terrified populace, living in a world of constant, brutal violence, created a monster to give a face to their deepest anxieties? The claims were made, the testimony of fear was given. Now, the search for proof, for some tangible anchor in the shifting sea of folklore, had to begin. The passage of time is a relentless tide, pulling the scaffolding of fact out from under the house of memory, leaving the structure to stand or fall on the strength of its story alone. In the case of Martha Purnell, the tide has washed away nearly every verifiable trace, leaving behind a legend as dark and murky as the swamp water that bordered her land. To seek the historical, Martha is to engage in an exercise of profound frustration, to become an archivist of absences. It is a search that begins not in the hushed, fearful whispers of a ghost story, but in the musty, silent confines of a courthouse records room, under the low, yellow glare of a reading lamp that does little to push back the encompassing shadows. Here, in the bound ledgers and deed books of Worcester County, the past is recorded in the elegant, spidery script of clerks long dead, the iron gall ink fading to a ghostly brown on pages as brittle and fragile as a dragonfly's wing. The air itself smells of decaying paper and leather binding, a scent of slow, inexorable oblivion. It is in this silence that one hopes to find a kernel of truth, a single, hard fact upon which the sprawling, monstrous legend was built. One opens the census records for 1820 and 1830, the heavy pages creaking in protest. The enumerator's handwriting varies, some precise and geometric, others a careless scrawl, their task a weary journey on horseback down muddy, rutted lanes. And there, on a page for the county's most sparsely populated district, her name appears, a brief, lonely entry, Martha Purnell. The household is listed as containing one free white female, of an age between 40 and 50. There are no other names listed, no husband, no children, no boarders, no enslaved persons. She is, in the dry, impersonal accounting of the federal government, a statistical island, a household of one. This single entry confirms her existence and her isolation, but it offers nothing more. It is the first and most solid piece of evidence, yet it is a fact as thin and substanceless as a shadow. The search moves to the deed books, the repository of the land's own story. Here, a transaction recorded in 1819 documents her purchase of 37 acres of land bordering the Great Pocomoke Swamp. The language is archaic, the boundaries marked not by precise survey lines but by the features of the landscape itself. A great cypress tree struck by lightning, a collection of 3 stones by a creek bed, the high water mark of the Black River. The description of the property in this legal document paints a more vivid picture of her isolation than any ghost story could. It was a piece of land defined by its wildness, its borders drawn by the swamp itself. It was, legally and geographically, a place on the very edge of the civilized world. Then, perhaps the most tantalizing and yet ultimately inconclusive piece of the puzzle is found in the county tax rolls. Year after year, her entry is consistent. She is taxed for her 37 acres of marginal land, for her small one-story dwelling, and for her livestock. And it is in the accounting of her livestock that a single, curious detail stands out. While her neighbors are taxed for a cow, a few chickens, perhaps 1 or 2 pigs for the family's use, Martha Purnell is listed as possessing an unusually large number of swine. In 1827, the year of the alleged incident with the 3 runaways, she was taxed for owning 24 hogs. For a single woman living on a subsistence farm with no major crops to sell, this number was an anomaly. It was a commercial quantity of animals on a non-commercial property. It begs the question that the legend attempts to answer. How did a solitary woman on 37 acres of poor land manage to feed so many large animals? The tax record provides a shadow of a motive, a hint of a grim economy at work, but it is not proof of a crime. It is merely another question mark, written in faded ink in a dusty book. Beyond these spare skeletal facts, the official record is silent. There is no court docket with her name, no record of an arrest, no minutes from a trial. There are no witness statements taken down by a county sheriff, no coroner's inquest into unexplained disappearances. This profound silence from the legal authorities is perhaps the most haunting piece of the puzzle. If Martha's activities were as monstrous and as widely known as the legend suggests, why was nothing done? Several possibilities present themselves, each as chilling as the next. Perhaps the stories were, in fact, just stories, the fearful fabrications of a superstitious populace that the local sheriff dismissed as swamp gossip. Or perhaps the victims, being runaway slaves, existed so far outside the sphere of legal protection that their disappearance warranted no official investigation. They were property that had been lost, not people who had been murdered. Their absence would be a civil matter for their former owner, not a criminal one for the state. A third, more sinister possibility is that the local authorities were aware of her activities and, in a quiet, unofficial capacity, condoned them. In the brutal calculus of the slave-holding society, she might have been seen as providing a grisly but effective solution to a persistent problem, a final, terrifying deterrent to others who might dream of freedom. The lack of official records, therefore, becomes a form of passive confirmation, suggesting a horror so deeply intertwined with the social order that the system itself chose to look away. With the documentary trail grown cold, the investigator must turn to the only other existing archive, the unreliable, mutable, and deeply human record of folklore. Here, the story of Martha Purnell thrives, untethered from the burden of proof. Oral tradition is not concerned with facts, but with truth of a different kind. It seeks to preserve the emotional and psychological realities of a community, to give shape and voice to its deepest fears. The story of Martha and her hogs was passed down not in courtrooms, but around hearths on long winter nights, in the hushed conversations of men gathered at the crossroads store, in the cautionary warnings of mothers to their children. With each telling, the story was subtly refined, its details sharpened for maximum effect. The historical Martha, a solitary woman with an unusual number of pigs, began a slow and steady transformation. She became a figure of supernatural menace, a witch who communed with the dark spirits of the swamp. Her hogs were no longer mere animals. They were her familiars, hellhounds given porcine form. The single rose bush by her porch, a small, incongruous detail of human care, was reinterpreted in the folklore as a thing of terrible significance. Some versions of the tale claimed its blooms were an unnatural shade of red because its roots drew nourishment from the blood-soaked soil beneath. Others whispered that it would only bloom on the night after the hogs had been fed a particular kind of meal. This myth-making process served a vital function for the community. It took the ambient anxieties of the time and place, the fear of the wilderness, the terror of betrayal, the pervasive violence of slavery, and concentrated them into a single, terrifying figure. Martha became the monster in the woods, the cautionary tale that reinforced the known boundaries of the world. She was the darkness that made the firelight seem brighter, the chaos that made the fragile order of the community seem more precious. Her story was not unique in its basic structure. Similar legends can be found throughout the American South in the antebellum period. Tales of isolated inns where travelers disappeared, of mysterious figures who lured the unwary to a grim fate, were common. These stories often tapped into the very real dangers of travel and the deep-seated fear of the stranger. But the Martha Purnell legend was uniquely shaped by its specific context. It was a story born of the absolute vulnerability of the runaway slave. In a world where any person could be a potential enemy and betrayal was a constant threat, the story of a woman who offered sanctuary only to deliver death was a powerful articulation of that specific dread. The real-life horrors of slave catchers and organized gangs like the one run by the infamous Paddy Cannon on the nearby Delmarva Peninsula, who kidnapped free black people and sold them into slavery, provided a fertile ground of truth from which such legends could sprout. Martha's story was perhaps a localized, more gothic iteration of this reality, her hogs a more visceral and elemental instrument of destruction than a simple chain and manacle. Ultimately, the question of how much of the tale can be trusted is unanswerable. The search for the real Martha Purnell ends where it begins, in a gray area between a few sparse facts and a vast, terrifying legend. We can know that a woman named Martha Purnell lived alone on the edge of the Pocomoke Swamp. We can know that she kept an inexplicably large number of hogs. And we can know that a story was told about her, a story of such profound horror that it has survived for 2 centuries, passed down through generations long after her house has rotted back into the earth and her name has vanished from every record but the darkest of local folklore. The historical evidence is insufficient to condemn her, but the persistence of the legend is impossible to ignore. The truth may be that the line between the woman and the monster had blurred long before the first story was ever told. The absence of concrete proof does not weaken the legend. It strengthens it. It creates a space for fear to grow, for the imagination to conjure the worst possible truths. It is this very uncertainty, this inability to know for sure what happened in the nights by the swamp's edge, that gives the story its enduring power and allows the ghost of Martha Purnell to walk still. The historical inquiry is over, but the haunting has just begun. The physical world eventually reclaims all things. Wood rots, stone crumbles, and the relentless green tide of nature washes over the artifacts of human endeavor, pulling them back into the anonymous soil. Martha Purnell's homestead has long since vanished. The unpainted clapboard house, the sagging porch, the grim, fortress-like hog pens, all have been consumed by the slow, digestive processes of the swamp. There is nothing left to mark the spot where she lived, and where others, allegedly, died. No historical marker stands by the roadside, for her story is not one that civic committees are eager to commemorate. The land itself has been parceled, sold, and repurposed over the decades. Yet, a place is more than just a set of coordinates on a map. It is also a repository of memory, a psychic landscape that can hold the imprint of powerful events long after the physical evidence has been erased. The legacy of Martha Purnell is not written in deed books or census records. It is etched into the folklore and the collective subconscious of the region. She lives on, not as a historical figure, but as a ghost, a spectral presence whose story is inextricably bound to the land she once occupied. For generations, the area around the old Purnell property has been considered haunted ground. It is a place that local people instinctively avoid after dark, a patch of woods that even seasoned hunters are said to skirt rather than pass through directly. The stories are no longer about a living woman of flesh and blood, but about the restless spirit she left behind. They are told by the descendants of those who once whispered her name in fear, the narrative now imbued with the authority of long tradition. It is said that on certain nights, particularly in the heavy, humid stillness that precedes a thunderstorm, A strange and unnatural cold spot can be felt on the stretch of road nearest to where her cabin once stood. Motorists have reported their headlights flickering and dying without explanation, plunging them into a sudden, terrifying darkness, only to have the lights flare back to life moments after they have passed the unseen boundary of her former land. Others speak of seeing a faint, solitary light moving deep within the woods, like a single candle being carried through the trees where no path exists. Some have claimed to hear the sound of a woman's low, toneless voice on the wind, speaking words that are impossible to understand but that carry an unmistakable weight of malice. But the most persistent and disturbing element of the haunting is not the specter of Martha herself, but that of her hogs. Her name is now inseparable from the creatures she allegedly used as instruments of terror. They have become symbols of her enduring will, spectral beasts that still roam the dark fringes of the Pocomoke. People who live in the scattered houses that now dot the area tell stories of being woken in the dead of night by a chorus of furious, guttural roaring, a sound that seems to come from all directions at once and is like no known animal. It is a sound, they say, that chills the blood and speaks of a primal, insatiable hunger. Farmers have found their fences inexplicably broken, their own livestock in a state of extreme agitation, huddled together and trembling as if from a recent, unseen terror. On more than one occasion, hunters have found the tracks of an enormous swine in the soft mud by the creek, tracks far larger than any wild boar, which lead into the densest part of the swamp and then simply vanish. The hogs of the legend have transcended their physical reality. They are now an archetype, a folkloric monster unique to this small corner of the world. They represent a terror that is both natural and unnatural, a fusion of the known fear of a feral animal with the unknown dread of a supernatural entity. To see the spectral hogs of Martha Purnell is to witness the physical manifestation of the region's darkest historical memory. The ruins of old farmsteads and outbuildings throughout the swamp are often attributed to her, even those that have no historical connection to her property. Any collapsed chimney or moss-covered foundation stone can become a part of her sprawling, spectral territory. One particular ruin, a collapsed smokehouse deep in a section of state forest, has become a focal point for local ghost lore and a place of pilgrimage for teenagers daring each other to acts of foolish bravery. They call it Martha's Smokehouse, and the legend attached to it is a direct echo of the alleged fate of Zephon, Alara, and Obadiah. It is said that if you stand inside the crumbling stone foundation at midnight and whisper the name of a runaway, you will hear the sound of the heavy wooden bar sliding into place, followed by the terrifying sound of rooting hogs just outside the walls, their breath hot and foul, their massive bodies brushing against the stones. Few are said to be brave enough to stay long enough to find out what happens next. The story serves as a kind of living memorial, a reenactment of the core trauma of the legend, performed by each new generation that inherits the tale. It keeps the horror immediate and personal, transforming a historical narrative into a present-day threat. Martha's name has also become a kind of regional shorthand for the ultimate betrayal. For centuries, in the isolated communities of the Eastern Shore, to accuse someone of being a Martha Purnell was to charge them with the most profound and unforgivable treachery. It meant they were a person who would offer you shelter only to lead you to your doom, someone who would smile to your face while plotting your destruction. The accusation was used to describe informants who betrayed their own people, business partners who cheated their friends, and anyone who preyed upon the vulnerable under the guise of offering help. This linguistic legacy demonstrates the deep cultural penetration of her story. She became more than just a woman who may have committed monstrous acts. She became the embodiment of a primal human fear, the fear of the enemy who wears the mask of a friend. Her legend became a cautionary tale that operated on multiple levels. For children, it was a simple ghost story, a warning not to stray too far into the woods. For adults, it was a more complex allegory about the dangers of misplaced trust in a world where survival often depended on a keen and cynical judgment of human character. The persistence of her legend begs the question of why this particular story has held on with such tenacity, while countless other tales of hardship and cruelty from that era have faded into obscurity. The answer may lie in the perfect Gothic horror of its central image, a woman feeding men to her hogs. It is an image of profound, elemental terror. It combines the horror of murder with the taboo of cannibalism, even if at one remove. It speaks to a complete and utter violation of the natural order, an inversion of the cycle of life and death. Humans domesticate and consume animals. In Martha's world, animals were conditioned to consume humans. It represents a total annihilation, a death that leaves not even bones behind for a proper burial. This powerful, visceral image is the engine that has driven the legend through time. It is so shocking, so fundamentally appalling, that it cannot be easily forgotten. It ensures that Martha Purnell, regardless of the historical truth of her actions, will forever be remembered as the woman of the Hogs, a figure of uniquely American horror. Her legacy is not one of property or descendants, but of a lingering, pervasive fear that has soaked into the soil itself, a fear that still rises from the land with the morning fog. The ruins may be gone, but the haunting remains, a permanent feature of the landscape, as real and as tangible to the people who live there as the cypress trees and the black water of the Pocomoke. The story of Martha Purnell, in its final analysis, transcends the boundaries of a simple ghost story or a piece of regional folklore. It becomes a cultural artifact, a dark mirror held up to the society that birthed it. To ask whether she was a monster or merely a woman demonized by a fearful community is, perhaps, to ask the wrong question. The legend's enduring power suggests that she was, in fact, both. The truth of her story lies not in the lost facts of her life, but in what her legend reveals about the deepest anxieties of her time, the profound terror of betrayal, the corrupting nature of survival in a brutal world, and the way a landscape can absorb and reflect the moral decay of its inhabitants. Her tale is not a deviation from the history of her era, it is the logical, Gothic extension of it. The morning fog that rises from the damp earth of the eastern shore still seems to carry the echoes of this truth, shrouding the past not to conceal it, but to reveal its ghostly, persistent outlines. At its most fundamental level, the Purnell legend is a cautionary tale about the deadly fragility of trust. In the brutal social ecosystem of the antebellum South, particularly for an enslaved person seeking freedom, the act of trusting another human being was the ultimate gamble. Every stranger was a potential enemy, every offer of help a potential trap. The landscape of the journey to freedom was not just a physical one of tangled woods and treacherous swamps, it was a psychological minefield of shifting allegiances and potential betrayals. Martha Purnell, in the telling of the story, becomes the monstrous archetype of this specific fear. She represents the absolute worst-case scenario, the helper who is, in fact, the executioner. The horror of her alleged actions is magnified by the initial act of charity, the offering of bread and water, the promise of a safe place to rest in the smokehouse. These are not the actions of an obvious monster. They are the calculated deceptions of a predator, gestures designed to disarm the wary and exploit the desperate. The smokehouse, a place normally associated with the preservation of food and by extension, the sustaining of life, is transformed into an anteroom to oblivion. This inversion is the core of the psychological terror. It poisons the very concept of sanctuary. If a solitary woman offering aid in the wilderness cannot be trusted, then who can be? This narrative served as a powerful, if terrifying, piece of cultural instruction for the enslaved community. It was a story that would have been passed along the secret networks of communication, a grim warning to be attached to the geography of the Pocomoke Swamp. It taught that desperation could be a fatal liability, and that the appearance of safety could be the most dangerous illusion of all. The legend reinforced a necessary, life-saving paranoia, but it also spoke to the fears of the white community, albeit in a different way. In a society built upon the constant threat of violence and rebellion, the fear of betrayal was pervasive among the slave-holding class as well. They feared betrayal from the people they enslaved, from poor whites who might be convinced to aid runaways, and from each other. The character of Martha Purnell, a woman operating outside the established social norms, a solitary figure in league with the darkness of the swamp, represented a breakdown of the established order. She was an agent of chaos who, even if she was serving the interests of the slave patrols, was doing so on her own monstrous terms. Her story was a reminder that the violence they had institutionalized could take on new, uncontrollable forms, and that the wilderness at the edge of their cleared fields could produce its own unique and terrible enforcers. The hogs themselves are central to the story's symbolic weight. They are far more than mere instruments of disposal. They are a potent metaphor for the insatiable hunger and moral corruption that defined the institution of slavery. In their unnatural size, their extreme aggression, and their ravenous appetites, they embody the grotesque consumption at the heart of the slave economy. It was a system that literally consumed human beings, devouring their labor, their freedom, and their lives for the sake of profit. The hogs, fed on human flesh, become the most literal and visceral manifestation of this principle. They are the final, grim station of a supply chain that begins on a distant continent and ends in a muddy pen in a Maryland swamp. Their existence represents a profound corruption of the natural order. The pig, a domestic animal bred for sustenance, is transformed into a predator, its nature twisted to serve a depraved purpose. This mirrors the way the institution of slavery corrupted the humanity of everyone it touched. It twisted the natural relationship between human beings into one of owner and property, forcing people to suppress their empathy and compassion in order to participate in, or even just survive within the system. Martha, in this interpretation, becomes a kind of high priestess of this corrupt order, tending to her flock of living sins, her work a dark sacrament of the prevailing economy. The metallic, sweet smell that was said to hang over the pens was not just the scent of death, it was the scent of a society's moral rot made manifest. Finally, the legend of Martha Purnell serves as a cultural mirror, reflecting the deepest dreads of the society that created and sustained it. The story is a product of its specific time and place, a piece of American Gothic horror that could only have grown from the haunted soil of the slave-era South. It encapsulates the profound ambivalence towards the wilderness. The Pocomoke Swamp was, on the one hand, a place of terror and chaos, a trackless wilderness where civilization's rules did not apply. It was a place where one could get lost and die, a place that harbored snakes, predators, and disease. On the other hand, for the enslaved, it was also a place of potential freedom, the one landscape that offered a chance of escape from the ordered, manicured brutality of the plantations. The legend of Martha Purnell locates its horror precisely at the nexus of this duality. She is a figure of the wilderness, her homestead the final, treacherous gate between the world of bondage and the promise of freedom. Her story declares that the wilderness, for all its natural dangers, holds a human monster far more terrifying than any beast, and that the greatest threat is the one that mimics humanity. Ultimately, The question of Martha Purnell's guilt or innocence becomes secondary to the cultural work her legend performs. Whether she was a real serial killer, a collaborator with slave catchers, or simply a deeply antisocial woman whose strangeness was woven into a monstrous narrative by her neighbors, her story became a vessel for the fears of her community. She may have been a monster created by society, but she was created in its own image. Her alleged crimes, in their calculated brutality and their dehumanizing logic, were a microcosm of the larger, state-sanctioned horrors of slavery. She is the scapegoat who allows the society to project its sins onto a single, grotesque figure, cleansing itself by condemning the reflection it cannot bear to see. The morning fog eventually burns off, but the memory it carries remains. The story of Martha Purnell lingers because it is not, in the end, her story alone. It is the story of the darkness that lay at the heart of a nation, a darkness that could turn a simple farm into an abattoir, a domestic animal into a demon, and a human being into a monster. The record on Martha Purnell is now complete, and your presence through its final page means more than you know. If you have just found our channel, for more, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive, so you are here when the next file is unsealed, and tell us in the comments how this story spoke to you.